In this video, we're going to take a look at how we can make multiple themes or skins for Tailwind CSS, leveraging the power of CSS custom properties or CSS variables. Let's get straight into it. All right, so let's take this call to action bit of UI here and imagine that we want to create multiple skins or themes for it. I'll just give ourselves some room for the code here. This call to action is using multiple shades of the blue color. Let's say we wanted to create another one of these, which uses red color shades. So I could grab the entire component here and duplicate it and come here in our new component and grab all the instances of blue. So there's another 1, 2, 3, and change that to red. And now we have two pretty good looking call to actions with different skins. This is not technically theming though. This is just two different components or blocks of markup. One could argue that a real theming approach would mean that you don't change any classes on your markup. You take the exact same block of HTML and then depending on the theme that is applied, things look different. So let's look at how we would go about achieving this in a utility-first CSS presentational class names world. So for example, we could have a theme primary class here, and this by itself would apply different styles to the component. To do this, we're going to leverage the powerful CSS custom properties, also known as CSS Variables. For this example, I want to focus on the colors only. So by theme, we're just going to change the color scheme for each skin. Okay, so the first thing to consider when making an interface themable is the naming convention we're going to use. For colors, we want to steer away from hard-coded color names, like for example here, BG Red 700. Instead, we want to go for a name that doesn't make any design assumption and rather opt for a more semantic, descriptive naming convention. To get started, let's take a look at our components and try to identify what sort of themable colors we want to be working with here. So if we start with text, you can see that we have this white color here applied to the headline and also this button. We have a slightly muted version of this color for the paragraph, and then we have an inverted color for when the text is on white background color. So in terms of descriptive semantic names, we could think of that as here the text base. This could be the text muted, and this could be the text inverted. So let's jump in our CSS file, and we're going to declare a few CSS custom properties to represent these names that we've just identified. So I'll come down here and we'll do our work in the base layer. So at layer base. And now we'll define default values for our CSS variables. So we want them to be available globally. So we can use the root scope for that. We'll start by defining our base color and we can call this color text base. And in the case of our default theme, this is just going to be white. So FFF. Next, we'll have our text muted. So color text muted. And for this one, we're going to go with C7D2FE. Finally, we'll have our inverted text color here. So color text inverted. And that one will be 4F46E5. All right, so I think we're good for our text colors here. And now we're going to look at the background colors that we want to work with. The most obvious one we have here is the background color or fill color. So I'll declare this one as color fill. 433HCA. And then we have our different buttons here. So this is the primary button or the accent button, and this one might be called the muted button. So let's go next with color button accent. And here it's going to be white as well, so FFF. And notice that when I hover over this accent button, there's a slight color change. So we'll also have a color for the button accent hover. Color button accent hover. And that color here will be EEF2FF. And I'll just move that to make things align nicely. And I think we've got one more color to handle for the muted button. The hover color change is actually a background opacity change here. So we'll just use one color, color button muted. And we'll go with 6366F1. So we've now defined 7 CSS variables, and the name of these doesn't contain any design opinions. Cool, so now with this in place, we want to go and create Themeable Tailwind utilities. So let's head over to our config file. Remember, we want to use the exact same utility class for every theme. So instead of using different keys for each theme, we want to use a single key that encompasses all the different possible themes, and I'll use skin. So for the text colors, I will extend the text color object. I can open my skin key. Since we already came up with names in our CSS variables, we're going to mirror this naming convention, but we might skip the text word and just use base here. So now in here, we're going to use our CSS variable value. And the way you consume a CSS variable is by using var and then the name of the variable. So in our case, it's color text base. So let's test that out. And what I'll do is I'll duplicate the call to action and I'll adjust the window once again. And now we're going to replace the hard-coded colors in our first component with our Themeable utility classes. So we've identified this text base color to be used in two places. The first one being this h2 tag here. So I'll go find the hard-coded text white color. And instead of white, we're going to use skin. And we should have the text skin base available. Yep. And let's save that. And so now nothing changed because the CSS variable is holding the white color. So this is the exact same color. But let's come in our CSS and change here the value of the text base color. And let's make it black instead. So 000,000. And you can see that it has adjusted to the new value of the CSS variable. So it's working. Well, it looks like it's working. It's almost working. But as you'll see in a little bit, there's a subtle detail that we need to address. And we'll do this at the end of the video. So let me revert back to FFF for white. And we'll go back in our Tailwind config and add more colors. So let's duplicate that one. And this one, instead of base, and I can also select the name of the variable, is going to be muted. And I can do that one more time, select both, and this time it's going to be inverted. Okay, so let's add our other colors. And this one will go in the background color object because they're background colors. Again, I'll open a skin object inside of that. The first one here will be for the fill color, so fill, and it's going to be var -- color fill. I'll duplicate that. The next one is going to be button accent, and here it's also button accent. We have the hover variation of this, so I can select both button accent and add hover at the end. And we have one more for the muted button, so here accent hover is going to be replaced by muted. So that's our 7 colors mapped to the 7 CSS variables that we've defined. There's one extra little thing that we need to make themeable. It's not directly obvious on this design, but if you look at the background image, you can notice that it's more visible on the bottom right than it is on the top left. And there's actually a gradient overlay that goes from a solid color via a solid color to a transparent color. So if I go in the HTML and actually remove this for a second, you will see what I mean. Now we can see the image through the entire call to action, and the text is a little bit harder to read. So what we've done here is layer an absolutely positioned div over the image and have a background gradient to bottom right. And the from and via colors are the same solid color, which happens to be the same color than the fill. So we're going to reuse that CSS variable. And then finally, the to value is set to transparent. So this overlay is going to use the color fill CSS variable because it's always the exact same as the background color. But since it defines gradient stops, we're going to extend another object, which is the gradient color stops object. Once again, let's scope out to a skin object. And we'll call this one hue. And like I mentioned, we'll consume the same CSS variable than the fill, so color fill. Right, so now we should have all our themeable color utilities available. So let's go and replace the hard-coded values in the first component here with our themeable color utilities. So we want to replace all the hard-coded color values, and essentially that's anything that contains red. So you can see there's a bunch here, but also white because we have this white hard-coded background color. And oops, remember how I mentioned that the text white color was used for the heading tag, but also for the muted button here. So we're also gonna change this with text skin base like we've done here for the heading tag. So starting from the top, we have first our BG red 700 here, which is our fill background color. So instead of BG red 700, I'll use skin, and we've called it BG skin fill. So when I save this, the color should become this color fill color, which is our purple indigo color. So you can see that the background color is actually correctly applied to this indigo color, but we have our gradient overlay on top of here. And if I come down here, you can see that we have from red 700 and via red 700. And both this red 700 can be replaced with the skin-hue color that we've defined for the gradient stops. Very nice. Moving down, the next instance of red, I believe, is this text red 200, which is our color muted. So instead of red 200, I'll go with skin, and we'll go with text skin muted. Perfect. So next we're going to take care of our buttons. I can see some text red here. So for the first link, instead of text red 700, here we're going to have our inverted text since it's on the background that matches the base color. So text skin inverted. And here the background white is going to be instead skin. And since this is the accent button, background skin button accent. Finally, our hover state, instead of BG red 50, we're going to have BG skin button accent hover utility. So let me save that button. And you can see the text with the correct color. And when I hover, we have this subtle, very light purple. Perfect. Just the last button to go. So we've already applied the text skin base, which is the white color. And then this BG red 600 will become instead BG skin. And you tell me which one, button muted. And let's save that. And here we go. We've now completed our Themeable component, which is now ready to welcome multiple color schemes. Now, if we compare our Themeable component here with the hard-coded component below, if you have attention to details, you might have noticed something that actually is not working. If I look at the muted button here, you can see that we've lost the hover effect and we actually have a full solid background color. We've lost the transparency, the opacity of the background. If I come down here, this button here changes opacity on hover. Turns out that the way that we've implemented our colors here in our config works fine with solid colors, but it doesn't support opacity utilities. With what we have here, all the colors will be always 100% solid, even if we try to apply text opacity or background opacity utilities like we are in this button muted. I'll show you at the end of the video how to fix this, but before that, let's create a few more themes and see how our component handles them. Because after all, we've done all this work of creating custom CSS variables, naming them properly to be able to support multiple themes. All right, let's quickly get rid of this reference component because we've implemented it properly. And let's do this. Our current default CSS variables here are scoped to the root, which means that they're available globally. One super cool thing about CSS variables is you can redefine their values at any point, which means that you can create new scopes where the values that this variable holds is different. So let's create a new scope and I'll create a class here that's called Theme Swiss, because why not? And inside there, I'll actually copy all these 7 custom properties and we'll redefine them with different values. So let me really quickly change that. And I'll repeat the same process one more time to create one more theme. And this theme we're going to call Theme Neon. And again, I'll fast forward while I change the colors. And there we go. So you can see we have now 3 themes, or the default theme, and then 2 themes, Theme Swiss and Neon, that redefine the same variables with different colors. So now I'll go in the HTML and I will triplicate this component 2, 3. So now we have 3 times the exact same components, but it's technically able to receive a theme. So let's go to the top here and let's test out the scoping of our themes. So if I take the wrapping parent here, which wraps the 3 components, and here I apply the Theme Swiss class, all our 3 components should now become Swiss. And look at all this red and white. It's working on all 3 components. But now if I move this theme class away from the wrapping parent and I apply it just to the first one, only the first element should be Swiss themed, and then the other 2 still have the default. So we're gonna go and we leave the second one as the default theme, so we don't apply any class. And the third one here will have the Theme Neon class to use the other theme. So let's make that bigger now. And so we have our Swiss theme here, our default theme, and our neon theme. And as you can see, the neon has a text which is darker than the background. So the text inverted here is actually white on dark instead of being a color on white. And this is why we carefully name the text color text base and text inverted instead of text light and text dark. So like I promised, before we wrap up, I want to show you how to fix this transparency thing where we have broken the opacity support for our colors. What's coming up now is specific to colors in Tailwind, and we first need to understand how Tailwind handles colors under the hood. So I'll just make a quick, simple example to illustrate what's going on here. Right at the top of my HTML, I'll create a little rectangle here. So we'll have classes of first M6 to get some spacing. We'll have a height of 12, a width of 12 as well, and some rounded corners for no other reason than making it pretty. And now here's what's important. I'll go BG Indigo 500 and also BG opacity 75. And here we have our 75% opacity indigo rectangle. So looking at what CSS is actually generated by these utilities helps us understand what's going on. If I hover over the background color, you can see that Tailwind first defines a CSS variable, TW for Tailwind background opacity, and sets it to 1. And then the background color is an RGBA color, and it's defining the values for red, green, blue. And then for the alpha transparency, it's actually using this TWBG opacity color variable. If you apply a background color by itself on an element, because Tailwind defines this background opacity to 1, the color will be completely solid as you expect. When we also add a background opacity utility to an element, all it's doing is redefining this CSS variable to the amount necessary. So here we have background opacity 75. So it's going to redefine this CSS variable to 0.75. So going back to our BG Indigo 500, this value here is now overridden with 0.75 from this utility here. And so the background color becomes a transparent RGBA with 0.75 for the opacity layer. The exact same principle happens with text opacity. So Tailwind defines a text opacity CSS variable and sets it to 1, and then uses that CSS variable for the alpha transparency layer of the RGBA color. The reason it's implemented like this is there's actually no such thing in CSS than a text opacity property or background opacity property. There's an opacity property that lets you control the transparency of everything on an element, but the only way to achieve a text opacity or background opacity is by using an RGBA color and play with this alpha channel that will decide of the opacity. Okay, so let me remove my little example here. And now let's go figure out why it's actually not working with the way we've implemented our colors with CSS variables in our config file. So if I take any of our Themeable color utilities, like for example, the first one, BG Skin Fill, we're not defining here a Tailwind background opacity variable. We're literally just setting a background color, which is the CSS variable. So let's now go find our button muted, which is supposed to compose opacity as well. So I'll scroll down here. And okay, so here we have our BG skin button muted. And once again, you can see that there is no opacity variable, and we're not composing an RGBA value and passing this opacity variable as the alpha layer. So what happens now when we want to add an opacity, like here, all we do is redefine this BG opacity variable. But this is not used in the background color, so it's going to be completely thrown out and ignored, and the color is always going to be 100% opaque. So if we come in our config file and look for the button muted color here, it looks like currently we're literally just passing the button muted color CSS property, which is just a hex color. So it looks like instead of doing that, what we want to do here is pass an RGBA color, and here use our CSS property for the color, and then compose this with somehow an opacity variable. But how do we get this opacity variable? Where does it come from? Well, it turns out that you can access this opacity value that Tailwind handles internally by defining colors as a function instead of just a string. So here I'll delete this, and instead I'll define a function. And now as an argument of this function, I can receive the opacity value from Tailwind. So now here we want to do something like RGBA var color button muted, and then interpolate the opacity value here, except this color button muted variable is currently a hex code. We instead want values for the R, G, and B channels of the RGBA color. Let me make a quick example. So our color is a hex code. So let's say FFFF00, which is yellow. And instead, what we want is to have something like 255.255.0, which is the RGB equivalent of this. So if I wrap this in a RGBA color, you will see that it's the matching color. And then we want to have the alpha channel coming from the opacity variable. And if it's 1, it will be full. If it's 0.5, it will be half transparent, 0.1 almost transparent, etc. So what we want is these three values, R, G, and B. So there's many different ways that you can transform a hex code into R, G, and B channels. But at the end of the day, if we know that we want R, G, and B comma-separated values, we may as well define the CSS properties like so. So let's try implement that as an example on the muted button for the default theme. So I want to replace the value of this variable here. And instead of the hex code, I want the R, G, and B channels. So you can easily find online a converter for hex to RGB colors. But here in VS Code, I have an extension that allows me to do just that. So you can see here, I have this convert hex to RGBA option, and this is going to give me the RGBA equivalent. And now I can go and remove the RGBA at the start, and also remove the alpha transparency channel because we just want the three values for R, G, and B. And now if we go to our default theme here, you can see that we've completely lost the background color, and it's because we need to implement that in our config file. So let me remove that. And we're receiving an opacity value, and what we want to do is return, and we'll go with RGBA, var, color button muted, which is now R, G, and B channels. So we can compose our RGBA with the A channel, which is our opacity value. Now, we shouldn't make the assumption that opacity value is defined necessary here. So I'll just add a guard block and say if opacity value is not undefined, then we can return this. And if it's undefined, what we can do is return RGB only with our var color button muted. Okay, so let's try save that. And if we've done things correctly, it should work again. And yeah, great. You can see now on hover, we have this opacity change, and you can see the image of the microphone go through the button. Perfect. So let's update our CSS variables definition for the Swiss theme and the neon theme because they're still using hex colors for now. So I'll scroll down, and for both my color button muted properties, I'll select both. And I will once again transform hex to RGBA, remove the RGBA, and remove the alpha transparency to just keep the three channels that we want. And let's check it out. The Swiss theme is working, the default theme is working, and the neon theme is working. Perfect. The muted button here is the only place in our UI where we've used an opacity utility, but we shouldn't make the assumption that this is the only place where we want to actually support opacity properly. Realistically, we want this to be the standard and every color utility to be able to support this. So to wrap it up, let's quickly go and implement support for this everywhere. Now, I'm pretty confident that you don't want to be writing this code for every single color definition. So the first thing we could do is abstract that away to a function that gives us the opacity value. So I'll come to the top of my config file here and define a function that I'll call with opacity. And this function will receive one argument, and it's the name of the CSS variable that we pass to it. And this function is actually going to return another function, which is where we're going to receive our opacity value. And this function, in turn, will return what we had before. So it will check if the opacity value is not undefined. If that's the case, it's going to return an RGBA value with the alpha layer using the opacity value, and otherwise just an RGB. But instead of passing the hard-coded variable here in both places, we want to use the variable name that's been passed to the function instead. So variable name. So let's go down here where we've used this. And instead of doing all this work down here, now we can just call the with opacity function and pass the name of the variable. we're not going to pass this var call because up here, we're already doing the var call. So we just pass the string of the CSS variable that we want. And here it's color button muted. So now if I save this and with a bit of luck, everything should still work properly. And also if we look at the output of the HTML markup, so here I'll go on the BG skin button muted, you can see that once again, we're now defining a background opacity value. And this is using this internal opacity value that we've grabbed from the function. And then we defining the background color as an RGBA. We're using our RG and B channels from our CSS variable, and then using the internal BG opacity variable to handle the opacity. All right, so you're almost completely done. Let me just do a little bit of magic here. I'll select all the hex code, so I can select just the first pound signs to make sure I've got all of them, and then select the whole color. And now all in one move, living dangerously, I am going to transform these to RGBA. Boom, look at this. And then for all of them, I can remove RGBA and the 1.0 alpha layer. So now all our colors are defined as RGB. So it's going to break everything. So now we're going to implement this with opacity function everywhere. So let's see if we can do a little bit more multi-cursor magic. So I'll select VAR and this everywhere. And I'll replace this with opacity. Open the parentheses and the quote. And then at the end, I will move my quote inside the string. It looks like every color is calling the with opacity with a string with the CSS variable. So let me save, and everything should fall back in place perfectly. Nice. And that is it. Thank you so much for watching this comprehensive tour on how to handle themeable components in Tailwind CSS while making sure that we support color opacity properly along the way. All right, I'll see you in the next one. Bye for now.